Hello, Wonderhussy here. Anyone interested in the history of Las Vegas is probably familiar with the story of Howard Hughes, the tall, dark, and handsome aviation pioneer, film producer, and billionaire who built cutting-edge military aircraft, dated beautiful Hollywood starlets, and then ended up shutting himself in a hotel penthouse for 4 years straight, saving his pee in glass jars and never once cutting his hair or trimming his toenails. There have been a lot of rich weirdos in Vegas over the years, but arguably none was richer or weirder than Howard Hughes. He'd been coming to Vegas on and off since the 1950s, but on Thanksgiving Day 1966, Hughes and his entourage rolled into Vegas in the middle of the night, booked the penthouse suite at the Desert Inn Hotel, and ended up staying for 4 straight years. When the hotel tried to kick him out so they could give the penthouse to a high roller, Hughes bought the hotel so he wouldn't have to leave. And when the bright lights from the casino across the street bothered him, he bought that hotel too, just so he could take the sign down. And when he couldn't find anything he wanted to watch on TV, he bought the local television station, just so he could play whatever movies he wanted to watch. Supposedly, he even tried to bribe Presidents Johnson and Nixon $1 million each to put a halt to the nuclear testing program in the desert outside Vegas because the bomb blasts were shaking his hotel room and he was worried about the radiation. He was that rich and that weird. Everyone has their favorite wacky Howard Hughes story, but mental illness is no joke, and apparently he had legitimate medical problems stemming from all the plane crashes he'd been in over the years, and he was in near constant pain, which might explain why he supposedly sat around his hotel room buck naked with nothing but a napkin covering his genitals because he couldn't even stand the feeling of clothing on his skin. But naked or no, Hughes bought up a ton of Las Vegas real estate and continued to grow his empire while sitting in that darkened hotel room before finally leaving in the middle of the night on Thanksgiving Day 1970. And when the housekeepers came in to clean the room up after him, they said the drapes were totally rotted from never once having been opened the whole 4 years. And moreover, it was said that Hughes himself never once left the room the entire 4 years he was there. Or did he? Just 6 years after leaving Las Vegas, Hughes finally died, leaving behind a ginormous estate worth $2.5 billion, which is like $11 billion in today's money. But he had no children, no immediate family, and there was no will, at least not at first. A few weeks after he died, a handwritten will mysteriously turned up at the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City. And this is when the story really gets weird. Supposedly, the will had been dropped off by a local yokel named Melvin Dummar, who claimed that a mysterious man had walked into his gas station one day and left the will on his desk. Now, this will left 1/16 of the Howard Hughes fortune to the Boy Scouts of America, 1/16 to the Mormon Church, and 1/16 to Melvin Dummar himself. The rest of Hughes' estate was dispersed pretty much as expected to his surviving family members and his business associates, but it was still mighty fishy, and it caused a huge uproar. I mean, who the hell was this random Mormon dude that Howard Hughes supposedly left $156 million to? Well, the story that emerged was so implausible as to be unbelievable. And it all started right here in a dusty little town called Gabbs in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. According to Dummar, 9 years prior to Howard Hughes' death, just before Christmas 1967, he was driving down a lonely desert highway called US 95 one night, heading to LA from his home here in the tiny mining town of Gabbs. He worked at the magnesium plant here, but he was on his way to LA to try and reconcile with his estranged ex-wife. And after stopping to cash his paycheck and gamble a little bit at the Mizpah Hotel in Tonopah, he continued on his way south. A little after midnight, he pulled over onto this side dirt road to pee and found a man laying face down, passed out in the middle of the road. Now, remember, it was the middle of winter and it was really cold that night, like down in the 20s. So at first, he thought the guy was dead and he started to get back in his car and go alert the coroner. But then the man sat up, shivering, and asked if he could get a ride to Las Vegas. So Dummar gave the guy a ride, and I guess at first the guy was shivering so badly that he couldn't even talk. And blood was coming out of one of his ears, and his hair was long and greasy and matted. He looked like a bum or a wino, but hey, Melvin Dummar didn't judge, and in fact, I guess he was kind of an aspiring country music songwriter. So as they were driving along, he even sang the guy a song he'd written all about how a man can lift himself up and become anything he wants if he just works hard enough. And then he also told the guy a little bit about himself, how he too was down on his luck and he'd tried to get a job for Hughes Aircraft, but they wouldn't hire him. And that's when the scraggly guy kind of perked up and said, "Well, if you want a job with Hughes Aircraft, I can help with that. I'm Howard Hughes." Of course, Dummar didn't believe him because what would Howard Hughes be doing passed out in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, 200 miles from Las Vegas? And at that time in his life, his personal hygiene was pretty bad, and he didn't look anything like the pictures that you would have seen of Howard Hughes in the media at that time. Remember, back then, the paparazzi wasn't quite as invasive, so the general public had no idea that Howard Hughes had quit cutting his hair and his toenails and was saving his pee in jars and all of that. So to Melvin Dummar, there was no way this scraggly old wino-looking dude could possibly be tall, dark, and handsome Howard Hughes, the billionaire. So he just dropped the old man off in Las Vegas and even gave him some spare change when he asked for it, and never heard from him again and never thought any more of it until years later when that mysterious man walked into his gas station with that handwritten will. Now, it should be noted that in Nevada, there is such a thing called a holographic will, which is a will that's legally binding as long as it's handwritten by the person whose will it is. But, of course, the Hughes Corporation, with all their high-powered attorneys, were never going to let some random Mormon yokel get a piece of their pie. So they hired all these handwriting experts to testify that there was no way the handwriting on that will was that of Howard Hughes. But the main reason no one believed Melvin Dummar was that by then it had become commonly accepted fact that Howard Hughes never left the Desert Inn the entire 4 years he was in Las Vegas. Well, shocker, after years of litigation in court, the will was found to be a forgery, and so Melvin Dummar never saw a dime of the Hughes fortune. And even worse, he said the whole thing kind of ruined his life because people either thought he was a crazy liar or they threatened him if he didn't share the money with them. And he said he had a hard time finding work after that because people either thought he was a crazy liar or they figured he was just going to quit once he did get his share of the fortune. Anyway, he ended up dying in Pahrump, right outside Las Vegas, just a few years ago. But although he never got any of the money, he did finally at least get some level of vindication. Because believe it or not, only about 7 years ago, the truth finally came out. I guess this retired FBI agent named Gary Magnuson started investigating the case on his own back in the early 2000s, and he turned up a man in Las Vegas who was basically able to validate Melvin Dummar's story. There was this crazy Italian count named Robert Dairo who ran an auction house here in town, but before he was an auctioneer, he was a pilot, and he ran Howard Hughes' private airport up in North Las Vegas. And according to Count Dairo, Howard Hughes definitely left the Desert Inn on at least a few occasions in the 4 years he stayed there. Remember, the official line was always, Howard Hughes never left his room at the Desert Inn from the day he checked in 1966 until the day he left in 1970. Well, according to Robert Dairo, Howard Hughes definitely left his room on at least a few occasions to go to brothels. See, Darrow had something of a side business going where he would fly guys up to the various brothels outside Vegas in his private plane. And according to him, Howard Hughes hired him on multiple occasions. Ever the ladies' man, Howard Hughes had apparently become infatuated with a working girl named Sunny, a beautiful blonde from Hollywood with a diamond embedded in one of her teeth, who was supposedly really hot stuff, and she was working here at what used to be the Cottontail Ranch brothel, just off US 95, about 200 miles northwest of Las Vegas, when Robert Darrow flew Howard Hughes to visit her one night just after Christmas, 1967. Believe it or not, the ruins of this brothel are still standing today, but they probably won't be here for long, which is why I wanted to make this video before somebody buys it and bulldozes it. I mean, water rights, marijuana cultivation permitted, and brothels permitted. But this is actually kind of a weird piece of living Nevada history, and I kind of want to document it before it's gone. Okay, so we're gonna have to use our imaginations. Imagine that it's just after Christmas, 1967, and you're sitting here in the parlor of the Cottontail Ranch brothel. You would have come in through the front door here and gone over to the right, over here where the bar used to be, so you could have a drink or two before choosing which lady you wanted to hire. Or, in the case of Robert Darrow, this is where you would have sat and waited for your client to do his thing. Well, according to Darrow, on this particular visit, Hughes went down that hallway to Sonny's room to do his business, and Darrow went in here to the kitchen to take a nap, which I guess was his habit when he was waiting for customers at brothels. Nowadays, the brothels I've toured have special lounges for the limo drivers and taxi drivers to sit and wait for their clients. But I guess back in the day, the madam didn't want him sleeping in the lounge, so she made him come back here and take his nap in the kitchen. Anyway, I guess he passed out cold and didn't wake up until the next morning when the janitor came in to clean the place up. And Darrow was like, "Huh? What happened to my client?" And the janitor told him, yeah, he got drunk and left with somebody else. Left with somebody else? Whew. Panicked because he had just lost a billionaire, Darrow went out and got in his airplane and kind of flew around the area looking for Hughes. And when he couldn't find him, he just went back to Vegas. And I guess he did go over to the Desert Inn to confess what had happened and was totally shocked to find Howard Hughes already there. Well, Hughes never said anything about it, so Darrow never said anything about it, and he never ended up flying Howard Hughes again, and he kind of forgot about the whole thing until many, many, many years later when he happened to read a story in the newspaper about that retired FBI agent who was investigating the case. Look, you can even still kind of see where the airstrip was. I actually read the autobiography of the madam who used to run this brothel, and she said that when a pilot would radio that he was approaching, they would just come out here and turn on the headlights of a truck to light up the runway. Classic Nevada. Anyway, Robert Darrow was more or less able to confirm Melvin Dummar's account that he had picked up Howard Hughes in the desert a few miles south of the Cottontail Ranch. I mean, at the very least, Darrow was able to confirm that, yes, Howard Hughes did leave the Desert Inn from time to time, and he was known to frequent the exact area where Dummar had always claimed to have found him, which Gary Magnuson, the retired FBI agent, later figured out was just a few miles down the road here. I guess they think what happened is he got a ride from one of the other customers who ended up robbing him and beating him and leaving him for dead here in the desert until Melvin Dummar had to take a pee and ended up rescuing him and taking him back to Las Vegas. What's really wild is that Robert Darrow had this information all along, all those years. But I guess even though the trial was like international news, he wasn't paying close enough attention to the details of Dummar's story, and he didn't realize that a critical sticking point was the fact that Howard Hughes supposedly never left the Desert Inn. And he didn't realize this until 2013. Now, I'm not sure how it works with wills and stuff like that, but I guess because the estate had already been divvied up way back in the 70s, by 2013, it was already too late to do anything for poor Melvin Dummar. And moreover, you could argue that nothing was really proven by Robert Darrow coming forward. I mean, it's not like he had flight records showing that he flew Howard Hughes here on the day in question. So it was basically just his word. But I don't know. I mean, looking at it objectively, he had no reason to lie about it. And moreover, there's one more critical piece of evidence that was uncovered when the Cottontail Ranch brothel finally closed in 2005. The madam of the brothel, who was in herself a fascinating character that I need to make a whole separate video about. Anyway, the madam of that brothel used to brag about having Howard Hughes as a customer when she was running for state assembly in the 1970s. Yes, the madam of a brothel ran for state assembly. I told you I need to make a whole separate video about this woman. She was fascinating. Her name is Beverly Harrell, and she's buried here at the Goldfield Cemetery. Anyway, she died in the 1990s, and one of the subsequent owners of the brothel ended up selling off all its contents in the 2000s. And by the time Gary Magnuson finally got around to investigating the story, the brothel was already pretty busted up. But left behind in the rubble was an oil painting of a beautiful blonde woman that the maintenance man said was a prostitute who used to work there, named Sunny, who was very popular and had a diamond in her tooth. It was a pretty well executed oil painting, not some hack job, and the signature at the bottom was that of a French artist who also used to do a lot of portraits of Howard Hughes's movie star girlfriends. Okay, remember how Howard Hughes was notorious for dating all those beautiful starlets? Well, I guess he would commission this French painter in LA named Henri Sabine to do paintings of them all. And the signature at the bottom of this oil painting of Sunny, found in this abandoned brothel in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, said Henri Sabine. Now, this is the part of the video where I'd like to be able to show you the oil painting, but unfortunately, the guy who has it doesn't want to share it on YouTube. I know, because I asked him. But if you look in one of Gary Magnuson's books, you can at least see a black and white reproduction of Sunny's eyes. Anyway, the whole thing with the oil painting is just circumstantial evidence, but taken in conjunction with the pilot story and the fact that Melvin Dummar's story hasn't ever changed at all over the years. Plus, there's a bunch of other really fascinating and compelling details in Gary Magnuson's books, which I totally recommend you read if you have any interest in this case. Overall, I feel like there's a pretty compelling case that poor Melvin Dummar was telling the truth all along. Unfortunately, no one has ever been able to find out what happened to Sunny and get her side of the story. I guess Gary Magnuson tried to track her down, but apparently she disappeared into the mists of time. But you never know. If anyone watching this happens to know Sunny or her whereabouts, please email me because I would love to hear her side of the story. She was probably born in the early 1940s. Beautiful blonde, diamond in her tooth, worked as a prostitute in California and Nevada. Who knows, she might even still be alive. Sunny, if you happen to be watching this, please contact me because I would love to hear your side of this story. Anyway, I just think that's one of the most fascinating Las Vegas stories I've ever heard, and it blows my mind that no one has ever made a real documentary about it. Seems like all anyone ever wants to make are the same tired old stereotypical mafia BS movies. Oh well, I guess that's what I'm here for.